Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to another Morgan James book launch. My name's Jim Howard. I'm the publisher for Morgan James Publishing, and today I'm really excited because we've got yet another incredible author to introduce to you. And today we have S. Mosby Marble. And Steve is the author of The Monkey and the Maze, an allegorical tale of developing leadership skills in business and in life. Steve, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thank you, Jim.
And I'm excited, man. I love this book. One, allegories are always fun. They tell the principles and give really strong life lessons, but in a fun, entertaining, and educational way. And I think you've done really well with this book. But what inspired you to write it? Monkey in the Maze. What inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Jim. I really appreciate it. And love to talk about my book. So certainly share some stories about it. You know, the inspiration for the book really came from, I guess, 30 years in the business world, leadership. Um, a lot of books felt like I'm a big reader. I felt like leadership books have become a little stale. I felt a little patronized by them, sometimes even condescending. I just felt like sometimes what I was reading didn't apply. It was like there's not a cookie cutter script, and I was looking for something that helped develop me, and I found that with all the leaders I was around. So it dawned on me. Really, it was sort of the passing of my father, and then kind of falling into my wife's illness. And I began to reflect on what I'd learned from them and my mother. And I thought, I've been in 2006, I really started taking notes because I wanted to write something. It was a different title at the time. And I thought, I just want to share all these experiences that I've had that I've learned from. There's not a magic pill, if you will. There's so much learning out there about civility, leadership, integrity, and it applies really to anyone. And so I asked myself, how do I tell that story? I didn't really consider myself to be so much a writer, even though I had worked for a publishing company for years. I said, I have a story to tell. And so I wanted to tell the story really aligning around things, like relationships, integrity, and the practices I'd observed. Some were good and some not so good. But really it wrapped around what I had learned from my parents from the very early years. And then my incredible wife, who I wanted to share a story around us. And so, the concept of allegorical tale, I will tell you, had I known how challenging that was going to be, maybe I would have opted for a different path. But I really did not feel compelled to write something that was, somewhat didactic. It just followed me through. I know everything about how to do something. It was much more around a story to say, hey, life is life. And if we can really pay attention and build relationships and show, civility, and I talk about, faith and family and fellowship and food and forgiveness, the 5 roots of the book, it really just started to evolve. And so the inspiration honestly came from watching my father, and talks in the book. In that story, the father in the book does represent a lot about my father, how he battled. He had multiple sclerosis, and he battled for years, and the successes he had in spite of the physical challenges, and his resolute strength and his faith. And then my mother, how she inspired me, and then my wife, and just, the story. So that's what inspired me was I'm going to try to write something that sort of quiets the noise. I wanted to make where people could enjoy the book and make it their story. I wanted people to get into this story, and before they realized it, the fantasy was their life, and they could put themselves in the place of Pete, and they began to say, oh, I recognize that, and they could apply it. And every time you read it, it would be different. So that's really what inspired me. That's what drove me to begin the process. And then I guess really to complete the process as well. Loved what I will tell you, writing the story was probably as therapeutic for me as it will ever be for anyone to read. And so even if I were not to sell a copy, which obviously I hope to sell some, I can tell you it was worth every minute because it really did help me to work through and appreciate so much about people in my life who have given to me, people in my life that I've given to, and really just the value of our community. And that's really what inspired me. That's what put this book together. When I was finished and I looked back over it, I was like, how did I get here? I caught myself up in the story a lot. But that's really the story. And of course, full-time job while I was writing it. So it was always a night thing, weekend thing, when I could find the time. But that was really, I guess, if I were to say, the inspiration was, I always think of life as a journey. The fantasy, the truth of the story, I mean, the fantasy of my childhood was a monkey and it was a forest. So it was sort of created on the facts of how I grew up and sort of how I coped with life. And I just grew that story.
Hmm. Outstanding. Well, you touched on a lot right there, and I'll tell you with allegories, it's certainly with every other type of leadership book or life lesson book, it can feel like you're learning something constantly, and maybe it's not always the right thing, but it's that author's view of what the right thing could be. But with an allegory, you get to put yourself in a story. You get to align yourself with a character, and you really get to see how those elements and his journey aligns with something you've gone through or are going through. And you did that really well with this book. But you mentioned, and that was one of the things I wanted to talk about. You mentioned some challenges putting this book together, and writing an allegory is different than writing. It's easier to sit down and create an outline of things that this is what I think, this is what I know, here's what I'm going to show you. But to be able to put that on a story mode and have characters and scenarios play out to reveal and illustrate those, it's a lot harder than you think. So you mentioned you had some challenges putting this one together. What were maybe your greatest challenge writing this book?
Well, I think the greatest challenge was finishing. Honestly, it was completing. Well, let me back up. Probably starting. I had written so many things over years. I'm always I'm a big reader, and I observe a lot. I watch and observe, and I take note. And so I really tracked a lot of things. And it was my wife just saying, you just need to write a book. You just need to write the book. You just need to write the book. So I began the process of writing. But I will say I attribute the challenge. I don't want to lose sight of the challenge, but I don't want to lose sight of this either. When I reached out to Morgan James with my first effort, I will give a lot of credit to David Hancock and the team, kind of helping mold me and form that story. I mean, he obviously saw something there. And then my editor, David Lambert, was also just amazing. So I want to make sure I give credit where credit's due, because those two entities helped me so much, or groups and people. But the challenge was taking what I knew to be true from what I had seen in so many years. So really, if you think back, my childhood, being around teachers, being around civic leaders in the church organization, my father being a missionary, just the various places I had gone, I had really tried to take note and be very astute and observe. And I was a very outgoing kid, but also very introverted. People didn't realize that. So I always tracked a lot of that. The challenge was taking all of that inside me. And as I began to write, I realized how much I had inside me, and to create a story. So initially it was almost like just chapters of events, like this happened, this happened, this happened. And I think once I reached out to Morgan James, and they kind of helped me understand how that can form, and then my editor helped me, and I began to write a fictional story. I really had to do a lot of research on understanding how to write allegory and fiction. The challenge was keeping the fictional story weaving through as I continued to highlight things I wanted to share with people. And I wanted to share with people, and I say this frequently when I'm talking to my leadership teams or groups, it always comes down to perspective. You can look through so many different lenses and see the same thing differently. And it doesn't mean anyone's right or anyone's wrong. It's your perspective. And that's what I wrote the story from, that lens, to say, this is a view into the life of Pete. This is a view of how this whole fantasy story evolves. And when you plug yourself in, you're going to see things differently, your own perspectives. Great. That's why it was written. But that was a real challenge, because I would catch myself getting to a chapter. And of course, it was sort of, disjointed, because I would write a while, then I have to work a while. I would travel, and I'd write in a hotel, and then you go back. And I recall one time I made a mistake, and I lost a couple of chapters, not saving the way I should have. So, you have these things you learn, and I learned from that, but I think it was better the second and third time around. So the challenge was weaving the story together, and making sure that I was giving people the perspective that I wanted to see. I wanted to honor my parents, who I have tremendous respect for. And really, it's a love story about my wife, who is the one thing in my life that has just been inspiring and constant. And so as I wrote through the story, it was hard to make sure I stayed sort of on pace and rhythm and kept the story flowing, but didn't get too caught up in my perspective, but more of my observation. And so that was a challenge. But we made it, and multiple rewrites and multiple efforts at editing and various things. I'm very proud of the book. And what I'm most proud of is I know that people, when they read it, will find themselves in the journey. And I'm looking forward to feedback I will someday get when someone tells me I was in that journey and it meant this to me. And that's really the purpose of why I wanted to write it. And that was the challenge of writing it.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you for that. And you did really well. Pete goes through this amazing journey of discovery from, starting out thinking where he wanted to go and what he wanted to accomplish, and along the way growing into who he would become, and seeing life through all those different lenses, as you mentioned. And we all do that. So, everyone watching this today, this is not just a book on leadership or integrity. All of that is woven in, but this is a life journey book, and it can apply the lessons that you learn. You'll see yourself in every situation, whether it's your home life or if it's at work or if it's in your community. The life lessons that are taught in this book just align so well with everything that we all go through from time to time. So I think everyone needs to get a copy of this book, read it, and see what Pete goes through and what you can discover through his journey. So, Steve, is there a favorite section of the book that you have, or a favorite maybe piece that you want to share with the audience today?
This is a really good question. Well, I can tell you, anytime I can write about my Ellie, that's my favorite section. So that's sort of the whole book. But there's a part of the book where Pete reads a letter from his mother. And I don't want to give away much of the book, but that whole chapter, that letter, that really does culminate and bring together a lot of the message of the book. But it's heartfelt, because it was me writing myself a letter from my mother. And I will say, hope my friends who are watching don't give me too hard of a time. There were tears when I wrote this book. I had times when I was very emotional. And fortunately, I had an apartment at the time because I was working away from home. And so I was alone when I was writing, which was good. But that letter, even just thinking about it, just speaks to me, because it was the culmination of the relationship, of that whole journey, what she meant, what she did for Pete, just all those pieces. Another part of the book that it's sort of a quote that really speaks to me from the book. It's in chapter 4, I think. And it's just a little piece, but it's something that I tried to weave in a little bit of a business principle into this portion of the book. And it was back when when Pete Eugene was alive, the father was alive. And it ends in the phrase that I write there is, it says, the choice is not whether to interface, it is the face with which we enter. And that little turn of phrase is just, as simple as it sounds, meaningful to me, because it is not whether I'm going to interface, it's how I choose to enter. It's the face I enter with. It's who I am and who I reflect. And I can't complete an interview at all without sharing my faith in Christ. And you'll see that at the end of the book. I try to write this book very much non-theological. I'm not weaving scripture in or anything else, but at the end, I certainly share my personal testimony. It is driven by my faith. And I want the readers to be strong in their faith. And I'm happy to share mine with anyone that would like to ask. But the book was written in a way that it really shares the principles, again, of faith and family and fellowship, food, which is work, and then, of course, forgiveness. I guess I'll stop with that. The whole concept of the fifth element of the tree, of the root, is fellowship. And forgiveness. And I think forgiveness is the critical component that we want to make sure we weave into any story. And I think that part of the book, as it wraps around all the roots of the story, is really critical. So that's also very important to me. But that gives you a sense of some of the things that I think are very important. The intro is very important to me as well, because it's the true story of what made me really start putting pen to paper. There was a moment, and I talk about that moment in the intro, and then I kind of close it off with the conclusion.
Beautiful. Well, and what an incredible statement to make about faith. And you're so right. Faith carries us through so many times when we're unsure, when we're fearful, when we're doubtful. That faith is what can really pull us through. And it is, as you said, it's woven because it's part of the journey. It's not overly stated, but it's very clear. And I love that about your book. So everyone out there watching, Monkey and the Maze is available anywhere that you buy books, online or stores. So get a copy of this book, because it's going to have an impact. I fell in love with this book when we first started talking about publishing it. And then when I met Steve by voice through a mastermind call that we put together to talk about the book, just fell in love with it, and it does not disappoint. It's very powerful. It's a strong journey, and I encourage all of you to get your copy today. So Steve, if people are watching this right now, maybe they've got a copy of the book, or they're waiting to receive a copy. How can people connect with you? How can people get in touch with more of what you're doing?
Well, yeah, thanks for the question. I guess I'll say to everyone first, be patient with me. I still have my full-time job. I'm designing a website, so it'll be themonkeyandthemaze.com. That should be up relatively soon in May. I also have a Twitter. I think it's S Mosby on Twitter, S Mosby Marble, sorry, on Twitter. Or you could just email me. It's just smosbymarble@gmail.com. So I try to make it simple, really just starting to build and develop toward the launch of the book. So that'll all be in place certainly by mid-May. And of course, May 25th is launch date. But love to hear from everyone. That's, my goal is to start the conversation. So thank you for asking.
Awesome. Well, you started that conversation really well with this book, and I know people are going to be impacted by it. So thank you for taking the time today to talk with us, and more importantly, for going through that journey and writing this story for other people to be able to leverage to get on their best journey. So Steve, thank you for taking the time to talk with us today.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Jim. Appreciate it.
And thank you guys out there for watching, and we hope to see you on our next one.